Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
Dave Dahlke of West Baraboo is a Republican candidate in the 81st Assembly District. The election is November 3. Dave, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm curious, what do you consider your top 1 and 2 campaign issues, sir?
Well, based on the recent events, obviously healthcare, obviously making sure that people are taken care of in this, and then the COVID response are probably my top 2. And then to piggyback off of those two, if you want to call those two, the really important is the economy. Obviously, there's a budget going to be a budget hole for all municipalities to include the state, obviously due to the economic situation, but getting people back to work safely and growing the economy back to where it was.
Well, let's talk about a potential budget hole because of the pandemic. Let me make up a number. If we collect $1 billion less in state tax collections, and you're in the legislature, how would you fill that shortfall?
Well, unfortunately, raising taxes is probably not a good option based on the current unemployment rate, the economic situation. So raising taxes. So then, obviously, as a legislator, in the village, we have a fiduciary responsibility to live within our means. So sometimes you just got to get skinny and you got to figure it out. And it's not what people want to hear, but in lieu of raising taxes, I'd rather figure out what we can cut that or reduce services to get us through the bridge the gap.
Well, let's talk about yesterday when the governor extended the statewide mask edict. How do you feel about him extending that to November 21?
I support the mask mandate. As long as people are, based on the CDC and the government guidelines for close proximity, really it'd be nice to get the economy back going, restaurants and things going, but, we've got to still adhere to those standards if we can, practice good social distancing, be respectful of other folks when you're in close proximity, wear a mask, and just take care of each other. So I do support that. I understand the urgency of the mandate, but I don't want to politicize it where it's one way or the other. Because not one size fits all. But when you have an event or you're going out, some places, just be respectful and be mindful of that mandate.
Well, go back to another scenario on the next state budget. If you're in the legislature and voting on it, the frontline role hospitals have played both in Wisconsin and nationally treating COVID-19 patients. In the next state budget, should hospitals be an even greater priority than they might be in the current one, Dave?
I think that needs to be looked at. That's a great question. And I think this has highlighted a shortfall. This current situation's highlighted that's something, the state seriously needs to look at because they're combating this on the front lines. And making sure they have the resources to deal with the virus. So I think that's something that we certainly need to look at as an option.
One more question on the pandemic. A bill introduced in the legislature 2 weeks ago says if you're an organization and you follow COVID-19 protocols to protect your patients or customers or employees, you would be immune from being sued over COVID. Is that a bill you could vote for?
That would be a bill I could support. Obviously the severity of the COVID, if you look at influenza, if you look at, lung cancer, you look at all the, mono, all the things that are going around that naturally we just deal with, whether it be a cold or the flu. Just because you catch that from somebody that you were in an establishment, I don't think you should be able to turn around and sue them for that. So I would think that immunity based on those practices would be a good thing.
The whole debate over policing reforms has been played out over the last 4 or 5 months, even in Kenosha. The speaker's going to form a task force. Republican Senator Van Wangard's got 7 or 8 bills. The governor has 9 bills. The Black Caucus has bills. My specific question, is there any policing reform that you'd like to see enacted into law? Excuse me.
Well, I think obviously with what's going on across the country, there are a few isolated incidents, where within law enforcement there's a few bad apples, but I don't think we should paint the entire organization with the same brush. But to your point, yes, I would be in favor of some police reforms, some increased training to make sure that certain, when they say chokeholds and things like that, no knock warrants, that type of stuff, that stuff's being looked at and, not being utilized. Obviously, chokeholds are not a good thing, but, situations, obviously in a life-threatening situation, you have to react based on the situation. And you just have to deal, the police officers have a really tough job that they've got to make instant decisions. But to your point, I think that, we need to look at some of those things and I think some reforms, some proper training, some different techniques, some training to give the police officers more options in the field for these combative situations, I think is important. So I would support that.
As more states around Wisconsin legalize recreational and medical marijuana, what's your position?
I do have some friends, obviously, that use medical marijuana, prescription CBD type stuff, and there is a noticeable benefit. I would agree that medical marijuana use there's some significant benefit. And so people, I know some folks that have epilepsy in other states that they use the CBD oil to counter that. So, and that's been really positive for the parents of these kids that have that. So I think medical marijuana use, should be looked at as an option. I don't think it should be the first option, but it certainly could be an option. So I would support, further research into that.
No, that's medical. What's your position on recreational?
Well, I'm not a big fan of the recreational. I was a military guy for 32 years, and obviously, based on the complexity of what I did, having a urinalysis and passing a drug test, certain employers you have machinery. I'm not a big fan of the recreational marijuana, legalizing it. I just think there's too many unknowns with that right now, especially if you're legalizing one side of it, but yet federal law still does not allow it. It's still legal in federal law. So doing it on, it just creates complications when one hand isn't, working with the other. It's really a tough thing because you can enforce it on the federal side, but then on the state side, you allow it. And then I know it's for certain states out there, just use Colorado where they legalized that. Obviously it was a big financial boost to the state as far as the sales tax on that. So, we have to look at, where do we want to be? And is that dollar worth some of those challenges that it faces? So I know there's pluses to having legalized marijuana, but there's also negatives too. So they both have to be weighed.
The governor wants a People's Maps Commission to draw the next set of congressional and legislative district lines. The commission would then forward it to the legislature to be enacted. What's your position on the governor's proposal?
John, I didn't catch your question. You were garbled up a little bit there.
Okay. The governor wants a People's Map. Sure. The governor wants a People's Maps Commission to draw the next congressional and legislative district lines. What's your position on that?
Well, currently, as you know, I support the current state constitution and how the districts are drawn. Basically, state law basically says every biennium the state, based on the factors that are outlined in the state constitution. I think I don't have a problem with that personally. One would argue the gerrymandering thing, but it's one of those things where I support the current thing. I don't know that we need to reinvent the wheel. it just, again, elections have some consequences. If the governor's happens to be a Democrat, and then of course the legislation is a Democratic majority, the shoe would be on the other foot. It just happened last biennium. Obviously, there was a Republican governor with Republican legislation, so obviously the district lines got drawn. And it's complicated. It's not a simple thing. When you talk about balancing assembly districts within a senatorial district, population comes into play. And then, of course, municipal boundaries come into play as well. So it's one of those things that it's a balance. But I'm in favor of the current system. I would not support changing that to what the governor is looking at doing.
Local governments like yours, the one you serve on, as a village president, you've lived with property tax caps and limits for local governments have lived with property tax caps and limits for more than 20 years to control property taxes on homes. We're a high property tax state. Do you think those property tax caps and limits should be continued?
Well, that's a great question, and I can tell you from my village experience, that the cap at 2% of net new construction, obviously, to increase the tax rate is a serious challenge. In the village, we've been able to, without raising taxes for the past few years, we've been able to maintain. It's again in the current situation, raising that percentage or changing that to allow a municipality to collect more. I understand the need to generate revenue to pay for services, but sometimes you have to, based on the current times, with the COVID deal and obviously the economic, impact that it's having on right now, I wouldn't support raising that right now. You have to fiscally manage as best you can, and you got to get creative. I can tell you that the certain municipalities are looking at street light utility taxes. They're looking at wheel taxes. There's things out there that you have some options to generate some revenue. Is that revenue enough to fill the budget shortfall? Sometimes yes, maybe not. If you look at what's going on in some of the bigger cities like Madison right now with some of the destruction, I mean, how are the taxpayers going to pay for that? It's just you're just not going to be able to raise the taxes enough on the levy limits to offset what you're trying to do. So I think we have a fiduciary responsibility. I can tell you at the village level, we take budget time very seriously, as does every other municipality across the state, including the state government. But you really have to look at needs versus wants and figure out that you're spending that money where it's intended to be spent, and not taking some money and floating over in this pot, and taking care of some other stuff. So you just have you really got to have a fiduciary mind and work through that process. It's not easy.
Let me follow up on that. To reduce reliance on property tax, should villages, towns, and cities have other revenue options? There's a Democratic legislator in Milwaukee who has got a bill that if a referendum passes, Milwaukee could levy a half-cent sales tax. Is it time to give local governments like the one you serve on options to raise revenue so they're not so reliant on property taxes?
Well, I think having options is something that we need in our toolbox, because sometimes you encounter these budget shortfalls where you can't make up the deficit. So having that as a last resort, not a first resort. But then the referendum piece is a big piece. Let the taxpayers by referendum either support or not support, what the intent is. So I think it's important to have that as an option, but I personally wouldn't want it to be the first option. I would look at all other options first, and then, okay, here's where we're at. We can't afford to do A, B, and C unless we do this. So, and that's where the voters would get a chance to look at it on a referendum standpoint. And then, again, just like school districts do when you see referendums, it's one of those things where you either get the majority or you don't get the minority part of it, and it passes or it fails. So it's a tough thing to sell, but it is a tool that needs to be in the toolbox.
The gas tax is 30.9 cents a gallon. The governor wanted to raise it last year to stabilize how we pay for highways and bridges. Could you vote to raise the gas tax?
I would support a gas tax increase, but there again, let's make sure that if we're going to raise gas tax, that those funds are being used on roads, not bicycle paths, not new buses, that type of stuff. If the intent is that you're going to raise the gas tax for road repair and get these things, let's make sure that that's where that money is going. The other part about that, the challenge is, these rural townships and villages like the village of West Baraboo, our state aid, for bridge state aid or for highway state aid is a really goofy formula. And it's what they give out in state aid is not going to fix my driveway. So the townships have a really tough challenge with what's going on because they have a very small budget. And you see it in the rural township roads they're just so deteriorated and there's no funds. So I think the state needs to work on not only if they're going to do the gas tax to support the infrastructures and state highways, that they need to look at the formula for state funding for the local road improvement program for the smaller municipalities and the townships that just don't have the tax base to put in 15 miles of new road on a town road. So I think those things need to look at. And I would support a gas tax increase. I mean, I like my $2 a gallon gas right now. I'm sure every constituent in the 81st likes $2 a gallon gas, thereabouts. And we would be probably willing to pay a little more, knowing that if that was really going to be used for that and not, because the current transportation language, it's really vague on where that money is. So we just need to make sure if we're going to collect it, let's spend it where we intend to spend it.
If a school board or a local government like the one you serve on plans a major public works project, should they have to give a preference to Wisconsin businesses?
Well, that's a really great question. And, I've had lots of experience with obviously the local governments and the RFPs for services, contracts for whether it's highway funding, building type deals, well maintenance, that type of stuff. I've never had a contract in the village of West Baraboo where we had outside the state, somebody bid on it. I mean, obviously competition is good. I mean, because competition also helps drive down the price. If you've got, certain people that you're looking at all the time, obviously you might not be doing yourself or the municipality a service based on the cost. You got to look at those things. I think it would be beneficial to open it up where other ones can come in there. The board, based on qualifications in the RFP, maybe they flush out, just based on that. But I think competition is good in the sense that you can get a competitive price. But again, you got to make sure you're getting what you pay for. So because you're using taxpayer money, not your personal money.
Final question: differences between you and the incumbent you're up against on November 3?
Well, that's even a better question. Probably the best one of the day. I would say the big difference for me is I've spent, basically the last 13 years at the village of West Baraboo. So I've been in local government for a long time. And I spent 32 years in the Air Force. So public service is what I've been doing it for a long time. But in the village, I have been involved with, the grassroots of municipal state law, how things work from that type of standpoint. So I'm in the grassroots dealing with the local issues at the local level. So whether it's, the county budgets, dealing with the county, where it's with a school district, we are engaged for the last 13 years. So I think I hold a huge advantage just having that local elected experience. Then you step forward a little bit and go back. My military experience, I think, is another thing. Public service is what I've done for a long time. I'm a people person. I'm all about taking care of people and doing what I need to do to help them. So that's the big thing. The last thing I would say is I'm engaged with the community. If I tell my constituents after I'm hoping I win that seat November 4th, which I'm confident that if I tell you I'm going to do something, I'm going to follow through. That's the biggest challenge I've had with the current incumbent. I've engaged with him on many, many things at the local level. And there's many things he's chose not to get involved with and because it was too political for him. So those are challenges. I'm not going to step away from a challenge. If there's something, whether it's Medicaid, or Medicare transportation funding from the feds through the state to the local municipalities, it might sound political, but I'm going to step up to the plate and get it done. Those are things that I would be committed to my constituents. I wouldn't be willing to walk away and say something's too political. I would get you an answer, and we're going to solve the problem together.
Dave Dahlke of West Baraboo is a Republican running in the 81st Assembly District. The election is November 3. Dave, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thanks for having me, and have a good day. Guys, be safe.
You too. Thank you.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.